Hi everybody, my name's Alec. I'm a fourth year Psych student here. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a 2017 paper by Wayne Hall and Megan Weir that describes a study by Lee Robbins and colleagues on heroin use of American soldiers serving in Vietnam. Hall and Weir described the Robbins study, how it came to be done, how it was designed, what its main findings were, and how those findings were received, and they briefly consider the relevance to drug policy in the States. So why was the study done? In the early 1970s, the USA was experiencing major concerns due to crimes attributed to heroin addicts. It's also a time when massive amounts of soldiers are returning home from Vietnam as the Americans pulled out in 1972. Two congressmen from the Nixon administration visited Vietnam, and they reported to the president that 10 to 15% of these overseas servicemen were currently addicted to heroin. So this is very alarming to Nixon and the public, who feared this returning army of addicted veterans would overwhelm their system, crime would skyrocket, and in response to this, Nixon appointed the first ever drug czar, Jerome Jaffe, who brought in some programs like screening veterans as they were leaving Vietnam, and if they tested positive for substances, they wouldn't be punished, but they had to attend 2 weeks detox before they could return home. Jaffe also commissioned a study that sampled some of these men after they returned to the U.S., and for this study he recruited Lee Robbins. So the study design. Robbins and her colleagues completed two studies. The first in September 1971 with a returning sample of 450 enlisted men who were returning from Vietnam and had screened positive for opiates. They interviewed these men 8 to 12 months after they returned home about their drug use during and after their service in Vietnam, and again screened them for substances. The second study was completed 3 years later on the same population of 450 men, but they also recruited a random sample control group of draft-eligible men the same age who had not gone to Vietnam. This part of the study was designed to assess how drug use in veterans compared to their peers who hadn't served, and how drug use in veterans had changed in the 3 years since they'd served in Vietnam. So what did Robbins find? About heroin use in Vietnam, Robbins found heroin was generally used behind the lines, and the men said they used it to deal with the irritations of military life. These included boredom, homesickness, and disturbed sleep. Of those that used heroin in Vietnam, 67% smoked it in a cigarette. This was due mostly to the extremely high pure rates of heroin over in Vietnam. 24% snorted it, and only 9% injected it. 20% of opiate or heroin users in Vietnam used it enough to experience opiate withdrawal symptoms. So only 20% were physically addicted to have withdrawal symptoms. So use after Vietnam, in the reassessment of the sample 8 to 12 months after returning home, only 10% showed use of heroin, heroin use, and under 1% reported becoming re-addicted. The main reasons veterans gave for not continuing their heroin use after returning home was not due to lack of opportunity, but were due to the fear of becoming addicted, experiencing adverse health effects, being arrested, and the strong disapproval from family and friends. Robbins found men were more likely to be addicted to heroin in Vietnam if they had used opiates before serving overseas. And it was very common among men who had grown up in large cities, those that were least educated, or had a family history of drug use, crime, or delinquency. Of other drugs that were sampled or researched in and after Vietnam, the study found that marijuana was the most commonly used illicit drug in Vietnam, followed by amphetamines and then barbiturates. In contrast to heroin, the use of these drugs actually continued at similar rates after Vietnam. So how were the findings received? They were actually, believe it or not, received hostily. Some people claimed that this was a fraud or a cover-up, and this is because people believed, due to media portrayals, they were afraid of this addicted army returning home, and this view of Robbins kind of diffused that fear. There was a dominant view at the time that heroin addiction was chronic and intractable, and that people believed this due to studies in the States that showed that 90% of treated heroin addicts relapsed within a year. So how could so few of these, only 10% of these veterans who were heroin addicts coming home not using heroin? 90% of them should be, not 10%. So Robbins' study in retrospect, some people dismissed Robbins' findings and just said, this is a very unique situation. The fact that heroin use and addiction among the soldiers in Vietnam and their low rates on return can be explained by the extreme difference in price, purity, availability, and social acceptance. Major barriers were overcome in Vietnam to use. For example, this is a very large group of young men aged 19 to 20 that were exposed to heroin during a deeply controversial war. Some of these men would have been drafted. Many of the soldiers just didn't want to be the last soldier killed in Vietnam. And soldiers under the age of 21 actually couldn't legally drink. So this kind of led to a perfect combination of use. The Vietnam soldiers' heroin careers were actually shorter and less intense than the careers of civilian heroin users. They smoked less often due to the military constraints, and they had a very high purity, so they were able to smoke it and not inject it. And their tours in Vietnam were 12 months, so their careers weren't quite as long in use. As for the purity, in the US, heroin was 10% pure. In Vietnam, it was 90% pure. So in the US, a $20 bag of heroin costs $6 in Vietnam, and it's 90% pure. The small percentage of veterans that did become re-addicted to heroin on returning had the same high rates of relapse as American civilian heroin addicts, so 90% of those that were re-addicted upon coming home. Robbins herself described her study as a natural experiment that provided an opportunity to learn what happens when first exposed to heroin occurs in a foreign and for many a frightening setting without the detriments of high prices, impure drugs, and in the presence of a disapproving family. The environment returning home was heroin was less available, was less pure, and it was more expensive. Injection was the norm rather than smoking it, and there's strong disapproval from family and friends. Robbins' study represents a historical case in which a population of young adults were exposed to large amounts of cheap and pure heroin. They used it when it was available, and the environment played a part in that. So what do I think about the paper? Well, I've heard about this paper referenced many times. Actually, in my book report I have to do, it's referenced in there. So I was interested to read it and sort of get a take on it. But on the one hand, it makes total sense to me. To me, it's the difference between being the rat with an electrode in your brain and you're being shocked, and this lever makes you feel good, so you're pressing it. And then you're taken out of that situation and you're put in Rat Park, say, and you don't need heroin anymore. But it also does bring up some questions for me, and particularly why other substances like amphetamines and barbiturates continued in similar rates when heroin declined. I don't have an answer to that. In the end, I would say 100% environment plays a part in addiction. But there are a lot of other factors to consider. And mostly I would say the young age, like your brain's not fully developed till you're 25. These guys are 19, they're 20. They're a long way from home, and there's nobody disapproving of them. So they're trying things. They're not becoming as heavily addicted as those back home because they don't have the opportunity to. And then they're coming home, and yeah, so it was an interesting article. I'm glad I got to read it and look at it. And that's it for me. Thank you.